Okay, in this chapter, we're going to talk about the Great Depression as well as the 1920s and the Electoral College. So, one thing to think about in the 1920s is that we saw a lot of prosperity, but remember, not everybody was prosperous, and we're going to kind of see the times when we started to go away from the kind of the progressive actions that were put into place and more toward a laissez-faire form of economics where some businesses weren't being regulated, and staunch conservatives were lowering taxes and weakening unions, and it really shifted from those progressive era movements that we saw during the Roosevelt administration. But first of all, let's talk about the 20s and 30s foreign policy. So U.S. foreign policy during the 20s was characterized by elements of being an isolationist. The U.S., remember, after World War II, opted to not to join the League of Nations. The thought was that if there is a conflict, the United States would be obligated to kind of intervene in any type of conflict that may be out there among League of Nations members. But we use this period as a type of isolationist view where we would stay in our own kind of world here. So we also saw a lot of prosperity, which kind of led to what happened with the Great Depression. During the 20s, the Americans believed that this was the place of opportunity, the place of growth, the place to achieve. And they were earning more, but also a lot of kind of innovation started to come through, and when it led to consumerism, where people started spending more money than they were saving. And we'll see what that got us into. So there was a mass production consumption society. Giant corporations were reborn. The prosperity of the 20s led to new patterns of consumption and purchasing goods like cars, radios, vacuums, beauty products, clothing, refrigerators, washers. And this expansion of credit in the 20s allowed people to be able to buy these goods, but it also put them in debt. People could also buy automobiles, and it put, the ability to own an automobile in the range of the average consumer, the reach of the average consumer, but it did put them at risk, as we know. Paying on credit is something that is relatively common nowadays. This was a new kind of innovation for the American consumer, and it also put a lot of risk on the American consumer. Mass consumption was vital to mass production, and during this decade, there were tons of advertisements that spouted out that were used to persuade people to buy, to cajole people to buy, to kind of give that spirit of the more you have, the more elevated you are in society. And we saw a lot of advertising bills doubling in the 20s, going up to $1.5 billion in 1927. Credit was established in the 1920s. The 1920s, credit helped business and corporations boost their profit and sales. We'll see when the stock market crashed in 1929. The excessive credit that was issued forced the consumers into poverty, and as a result of this, people could not buy, and more businesses failed, and consumer demand decreased, prices decreased, and the economy slowed because a lot of people also lost their jobs. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into kind of the causes of the Great Depression. We also had reactionary policies in the 1920s where we had a little bit more of a nationalist point of view. There was a lot of concerns about kind of the hyphenated American, or people were concerned for many Americans who were Jewish, there were Slavs, Catholics, who were thought to be somehow subversive and dangerous to American society. We saw the Emergency Quota Act that was put into place that restricted immigration to 3% of the number of persons of that nationality living in the United States. We also saw a revival of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan targeted people that were Jewish, Catholics, immigrants, liberals, intellectuals, and advocates of the new urban morality. Hiram Wesley Evans, who was the head of the Ku Klux Klan, thought there should be a return of power into the hands of the everyday, not highly cultured, not over intellectualized, but entirely unspoiled and not the Americanized average citizen. These revelations were really immoral and the activities were outright illegal. But as we are going to kind of see in kind of when we look at civil rights, that laws are only good if somebody's there to enforce it. So a lot of these laws weren't being enforced. The government's involvement in the economy was restricted. We saw laissez-faire economics come back into place. Minimal government involvement in the economy except to preserve law and order is the definition of laissez-faire economics. And this was a pullback from the progressive forms that we saw during the Roosevelt regulation that had really favored government regulation of business practices, how they treat their employees, how they treat other companies, pollution, unfair labor practices, free enterprise, and that kind of really restricted that. So in our capitalist system, remember, we kind of base off of what's called social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest. We had progressive reforms, like I said, through Teddy Roosevelt, and we also have a combination of what's called a mixed economy and a market economy. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get toward the end of the class, and we'll talk about the differences between supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics, and demand-side economics. So just kind of keep that in mind and look down the road when we talk about that. So when we talk about the Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939, and was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. It began after the stock market crashed on October 24th, 1929, which was called Black Thursday. Investors were shaken by the sudden decline, and even after six powerful banks took ways to kind of stabilize the market, the market still dropped, and finally on October 29, panic set in and people started selling off a lot of their stocks, which caused the market to crash and a lot of people to go in poverty. Between 1929 and 1932, the world gross domestic product, or the amount of the formula to determine how prosperous a country is, fell by an estimated 15%. By comparison, worldwide GDP fell by less than 1% during our Great Recession that happened in between 2008 and 2009. Investments also declined. Remember, there's no money coming in, there's no money to invest. Businesses failed, stores closed, including small businesses like mom and pop shops. Factories closed, which led to a lot of unemployment. Banks collapsed, people lost their savings, and unemployment soared from 5 million to 13 million in 1932. So some of the causes were, we had unequal income distribution for one thing, and a limited number of customers for the products pouring out of the nation's factories. So we were overproducing, and people didn't have enough money to consume. While individual prosperity increased during that decade, in 1925, 5% of the population received about 26% of the income. So you can see a disparity between the rich and the poor here. So the stock market crash, we talked a little bit about this. Black Tuesday, the market crashed, losing 12% of its value, wiping out $14 billion worth of investments. 2 months later, stockholders lost even more money, and they lost $40 billion. People started pulling their money out of banks, and it's causing the banks to crash. We did not have federal deposit insurance at this time, meaning that your money right now in a bank is protected up to $250,000. That means if everybody went to their local bank and pulled all their money out, your bank is going to be able to cover you up to $250,000. So a lot of people with a lot of money will tend to put money in different accounts and in different banks because it's per account, not necessarily per your own individual savings. So if you have money at Mission Federal Credit Union. You have money at Bank of America. You have money at Wells Fargo. Each individual account is insured at $250,000. You, as a person, are not solely insured for $250,000, if you can understand what I'm talking about. We also saw a reduction in purchasing across the board. Since people lost their jobs, they couldn't consume. They couldn't buy things. They weren't able to keep up with paying for their items they had bought on credit or installment plans or layaway. So we saw repossessions and evictions. And during this time, the unemployment rate rose above 25%, which is mind-boggling. That's a staggering number. So we had a lot of inventory out there, but we didn't have people who could afford to buy it. We also saw economic policies with Europe affecting how are pushing us into depression. Vowing to protect U.S. industries from overseas competitors, Congress passed the Tariff Act of 1930, which is better known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. This imposed near-record taxes rates on imported goods, which are called tariffs, and a number of American trading partners retaliated by also imposing tariffs on U.S.-made goods, and trade fell by two-thirds between 1929 and 1934. And there's a little bit more about it. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised tariffs on about 20,000 imported goods to provide revenue to regulate commerce with foreign countries, to encourage the industries of the United States, and to protect American labor. This made Europe angry, so they also imposed a tax on American goods, making them too expensive to buy in Europe. Therefore, we had trade restrictions, and it made it harder for American farmers, businesses, and companies to sell over in Europe. Let's have drought conditions on the Dust Bowl. Year-long droughts coupled with poor farming practices created a vast region from southeast Colorado to the Texas Panhandle that came to be known as the Dust Bowl. Massive dust storms killed towns, they killed crops, they killed livestock, cows, steers, made people sick and causing untold millions of dollars in damages. At times you could probably see things like dust devils, which are winds that are made of kind of like the sand and the dust. Not so much a tornado, but a thing that is can cause people to be able to not breathe and kill livestock because of those dryness and the drought conditions where the ground isn't saturated. And here's a good illustration of that I got from the Library of Congress. Between 1929 and 1832, the national income dropped from $82 billion to $40 billion. So that is a significant drop, as well as corporate profits plummeted. By 1932, 369,000 companies reported deficits, meaning they weren't making money, and industrial production declined by 48%. Industrial construction dropped from 949 million to 74 million, and 5,000 banks went under in 3 years, wiping out 9 million savings accounts, which is incredible because it shows you how much money that people lost. People lost a lot of money. Look at the graph. The next graph will show the descending pattern of full employment in 1929 when the employment rate was 3.2% to when it reached 35%. Just by comparison, currently our unemployment rate is 3.7%, and you could see the graph right here where had under 5% unemployment rate, then a spike because of the Great Depression, then a dip after the United States became a little bit more prosperous. There wasn't much aid given. New York families were offered an average of $2.39 a week. In Detroit, where the closing of Ford plants happened, they were given an assistance of 7.5 cents per day per individual. In between 1929 and 1932, farm incomes dropped from about $13 billion to 5-6 billion. And it's really interesting to see these numbers because these numbers are still staggering today. So imagine in 1929 to 1932 monies how much this $13 billion is. A lot of farmers, about 33% of farmers lost their land through a foreclosure or an eviction, which in nature made things worse through the Dust Bowl. In 1933, and lasting for as long as a decade, the Farm Belt experienced one of the worst droughts. On the Great Plains, which is in the middle of the country, hundreds of dust storms known as black blizzards blew away the soil, and the heat killed livestock. So what was Hoover's response to the Great Depression? Hoover was unprepared for kind of the scope and the size of this depression and this crisis. And his limited response did not help millions of Americans in need. Originally, he did not want to give out handouts. He wanted the American people to tighten their belts and practice a form of rugged individualism, to lift themselves out of this and to make well on their own and make good of what their talents could help enforce and to get themselves out of the Depression. He did encourage the Federal Reserve Board to adopt a policy of easy credit. But these programs were small in scale and highly specific as to who could benefit, and they only reached a small number of people who were in need. The people started to get unhappy with Hoover because of this, and he left office with one of the lowest approval ratings of any president in history. And we'll look at approval ratings when we get to talking about the executive branch, and you'll see kind of historic approval ratings for former presidents, and then we'll look at President Biden's current daily approval rating as well. So the government also established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a federal agency with the unprecedented authority to lend money to troubled banks, railroads, and other corporations. And in total, the RFC loaned out about $1.78 billion, most of it to large banks. So the New Deal came into place too, and this really helped the United States get out of the Great Depression, along with the upcoming war. FDR was elected president in 1932, and him and his New Dealers sought both economic recovery and reform. The chief concern of the Roosevelt administration was the immediate crisis, but they were also mindful of conditions and policies that had brought the country to its knees in the first place and were determined to correct them, which is really good foresight. One of the first things that Roosevelt did was to institute the Social Security Act of 1935. And by 1937, every state in the Union, as well as territories such as Alaska and Hawaii, had their own unemployment insurance programs. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these in a minute. The legalization of beer in April intensified the growing belief that new and better times were at hand. Confidence was also restored by FDR's fireside chats, where he went on the radio and gave frequent press conferences about the state of America. And it was good for the American people to hear directly from the president himself. It also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which I talked about a little bit earlier. This would guarantee deposits as high as $5,000 in 1934. Now it's up to $250,000 per account. So if you have under $250,000 in your bank account, it is protected by the FDIC. Now, if you're under a credit union, it'll be under a credit union guide, and it's still protected. But just keep that in mind. It's per account, not per person. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, it was a labor law and consumer law. It was passed by Congress to authorize and the president to regulate industry for fair wages and prices that would stimulate economic recovery. So again, we're starting to see kind of the consolidation of power into the hands of the government. And Section 7 of the bill protected collective bargaining rights for unions. The Public Works Administration, administered by Secretary of the Interior Harold Eccles, put people to work building infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, bridges, libraries, and public housing. Again, putting people to work, getting people out of the home and having them be able to earn a wage, therefore they could buy stuff. The CCC, the Civilian Conversation Corps, passed swiftly through Congress and proved popular and effective all across the nation. The planting of trees, fighting fires, stocking fish, controlling insects, building wildlife shelters, lookout towers, roads, and trails. And again, this was a way that the economy could be stimulated because people were being put back to work. We saw the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, which built and operated dams in 7 states that controlled floods and generated cheap electricity. They also improved area recreation, health, and education. On August 14, 1935, the Social Security Act was passed, and this was a thing that was passed to benefit people who are older and no longer able to work. It also helps people who are been victims of industrial accidents, has aspects of uninsurance employment attached to it, aid for mothers with dependents, and the blind and the physically disabled. When you reach 62, 65, 67, and 70, you can draw on your Social Security. This is used to help you have some type of income when you are no longer able to work. Generally, those are the retirement ages. Obviously, if you work till 70, you'll get more Social Security. And remember, you pay into it with your taxation. You pay half and your employer pays half. And it's a regressive tax policy, meaning there's a set price that we pay for it. Part of this package also includes insurance, Social Security insurance, if you are disabled and no longer to work or able to work before you hit 65. So if you're declared totally disabled by a doctor, you can start collecting that type of payments as well. And then if you are a survivor, whether it be a spouse or a parent, you can get what are called survivor benefits. And those are used to help people who may not have a source of income. We also saw AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This was an assistance program that was in effect from 1935 to 1996 and administered by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, that provided financial assistance to children whose families had low or no income. And the federal government authorized caseworkers, supervisors, administrators with discretion to determine who received aid and how much. At this time, AFDC was primarily created for white single mothers who were not expected to work. And there's still aspects of this today. Also, the wealth tax that was put into place, it elevated a variety of taxes paid by the affluent and big corporations to record level. It did not significantly redistribute the wealth, and it upset business leaders. Some people say that World War II got us out of the Great Depression. That's partly true. However, the quality of American life was precarious during the war. Food was rationed, as we saw in World War I. Luxuries were removed, taxes high, and works dangerous. The need for after the war, there was kind of an ideal for a resumption of prosperity. Loss of consumer savings, little debt, loads of pent-up demand, and millions of newly released veterans who needed housing. The need for these war materials created a huge spurt in production, thus leading to promising amount of employment in the United States. By the end of 1941, before America's entry into the war, defense spending and military mobilization started one of the greatest booms in U.S. history, thus ending the last traces of unemployment. So when we talk about Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally and permanently changed the size and scope of the U.S. federal government. So it took a lot of power out of the states and a lot of power out of the hands of private industries and put them with the federal government. So we're going to start seeing how we start getting into World War II. The next thing we'll talk about is the Electoral College on the political science side. Okay, thanks a lot.